Well, good morning. If I can ask everyone to please put their phones on silent mode, and let me also welcome you to the campus of George Washington University. It's a real treat, a real pleasure, and a privilege to once again host Chairman McCaul on campus. He's been chairman of the House Homeland Committee since 2013. At a time where there seems to be quite a bit of gridlock in Washington, D.C., I can say without any exaggeration, he is arguably one of the most prolific and, more importantly, effective legislators in D.C. right now, focused on a whole host of national security issues, and also chairs his committee in a genuinely bipartisan kind of way, which is very true to the issues our country faces on national and homeland security. I'm going to be very brief, which is very rare for me since I've never had an unspoken thought, but I'm going to turn it over to the chairman now, and afterwards we have an amazing panel. When you think about members of Congress, you don't immediately think CIA, you don't immediately think National Counterterrorism Center, you don't immediately think prosecutors working some of the most important issues facing our country, but I'm proud to say we've got three of the best members who have done just that following this discussion. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thank you for being a great friend to the center. Thank you for being a great friend to myself and to George Washington University. And most importantly, thank you for all you do for our country.
Yeah, thanks, Frank.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you, Frank. Special thanks to George Washington University for hosting me. It's a real honor to be here. I want to thank the students also for attending this session. I see a few of you out there. I have two daughters in college and triplets in high school. So when it comes to homeland security issues, I have some personal experience as well. And education is really the key. And that's why I'm here today. You're really the thought leaders of tomorrow on these most pressing issues facing the United States. The state of U.S. national security. I believe that American strength is a pillar of global peace upon which our allies and partners depend, and our enemies recoil. As I reflect on my time as chairman, I saw the rise of ISIS, and then I saw the collapse of the caliphate. I'm disturbed, though, by the evil that emerged over the last decade under retreating American leadership. But I'm encouraged by the progress we're making in eradicating this evil that has entrenched itself around the globe. And as an eternal optimist, I'm confident our nation is finally headed in the right direction. Moving forward, it's critical that we continue to reclaim our sovereignty. This includes enhancing security along our southern border of the United States, addressing vulnerabilities in our current immigration system, encouraging the responsible use of cyberspace, improving aviation security, and defending against malicious ideology, intentions, and actions of our enemies. On the southern border, really for too long, and I come from the state of Texas, I was a federal prosecutor in charge with the jurisdiction of the Texas-Mexico border. And I think for too long, it's been an open door, which has had transnational criminal organizations like MS-13, dangerous opioids and drugs coming across, poisonous narcotics, trafficked women and children have poured into our country, destroying lives, shattering families, and ravaging our communities. Despite the noble efforts of law enforcement entities and advocacy groups and government agencies, human traffickers continue to exploit thousands of migrants, making the arduous and dangerous journey into the United States. Security along the southern border is critical. As we know, there are glaring vulnerabilities also in our immigration system, as the Secretary calls them legal loopholes. I was in the White House, that sort of surreal moment at the table with both senators and congressmen, Democrat, Republican, as it was covered on live TV for almost an hour, discussing how to resolve this current situation that we find ourselves in. And we agreed to the 4 pillars border security, fixing chain migration, the visa lottery system, and finally fixing DACA so these children can stay in the country legally. I would argue, though, our nation's security has been weakened by chain migration and the visa lottery program, which is random. These two programs risk exploitation from those who do not share our values and actively work to undermine them. Look no further than the two terror attacks that we saw in New York City, where these programs allowed terrorists to legally enter our country and wreak havoc on our way of life. In 2010, the visa lottery program facilitated the entry of a 27-year-old ISIS-influenced Uzbek immigrant into the United States. On Halloween, he mowed down by vehicle innocent Americans, Argentinians, and a Belgian in New York City. Then in December, a Bangladeshi Salafist immigrant who entered the United States as a young adult through chain migration attempted to blow up a New York subway terminal in Times Square. I just happened to be in New York that morning, just a few blocks away. When the attack occurred, I was promoting my Congressional Childhood Cancer Caucus. And I remember being notified by NYPD about the attack. It reminded us that there's still a serious threat. Securing America's Future Act is a bill that was introduced by the chairman of House Judiciary, myself, to finally secure our border and to close these legal loopholes. This legislation authorizes the construction of a border wall system to stem the flow of illegal immigration. It also provides, importantly, effective technology, infrastructure, and manpower to defend our border. 5,000 additional Border Patrol agents, 5,000 Customs and Border Protection officers, including the authorization of the National Guard to provide air support to border security operations. In addition, we demand the use of the mandatory entry-exit system at all points of entry to address visa overstays. Why is this one important? The hijackers, 9/11 hijackers, came in legally and then overstayed their visas. The 9/11 Commission recommended in their report that we address entry-exit, a biometric way to determine when people come in and when they leave. Until we do that, we will never be secure. The statistics I have in the briefings are that 40%, up to 40% of the people here illegally are actually visa overstays. We also call for an end to chain migration to protect the nuclear family and the visa lottery program to defend against future exploitation to our homeland. We propose, rather, a merit-based immigration system to attract the best and the brightest, not pulling a number out of a hat. Finally, the Securing America's Future Act allows DACA beneficiaries to receive a 3-year renewable legal status while ensuring that gang members, individuals that have criminal convictions or convictions in juvenile court for serious crimes are not eligible for this legal status. With respect to jihad and the threats, our American way of life has been under attack well before 9/11. 1979 was the year that really changed everything. In 1979, the revolution in Iran brought the Ayatollah to power, where he still remains. That same year, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, and the Mujahideen rose to power, allowing Osama bin Laden to become a force to be reckoned with. Now, 39 years later, the threat landscape remains serious. My committee has been laser focused on the threat of foreign fighters leaving the caliphate and identifying gaps in U.S. government information sharing and vetting procedures. I established 2 task forces to address this issue specifically, and we enacted, as Frank mentioned, over 20 bills to make America more secure. John Katko here led that task force. Mike Gallagher is going to show up, I think, led it the second time. And we passed over 60 bills this Congress, many of which is just sitting in the Senate. These two recent terror attacks last year in New York, I believe, underscore the threat that we face from a determined enemy that does not sleep. Our homeland, our allies, our partners, our friends are confronted with this stark reality, and it will be for many years to come. And since 2013, we've had 150 homegrown jihadist terrorist cases in the United States and 179 ISIS-linked incidents in Europe. I would argue that Europe is in far more danger from the foreign fighter threat, from the refugees coming in, and the homegrown jihadist threat. These stats are really alarming when you look at them, and they're a demonstration of why we must remain vigilant in our quest to expel violent Islamist extremism from the earth by destroying the roots from which it came. This threat manifests itself in the unstable ground upon which jihadist ideology spreads, whether it's in the Middle East, North and Sub-Saharan Africa, the Philippines, and elsewhere. We must deny these radicalized enemy combatants from achieving their jihadist glory. And of course, the memories of September the 11th and the images of the planes striking the Twin Towers are never far from our thoughts. And while we're almost 17 years removed from this heart-wrenching morning, let me assure you, America's aviation sector remains a crown jewel of ISIS and other terrorist groups targeting our homelands. Late last year, the director of the National Counterterrorism Center testified before my committee that they are seeing a surge in terrorist activity against commercial airlines. Recently, we discovered that terrorists had the capability to create bombs from laptops. And we remember the AQAP printer bomb plot in 2010. Unfortunately, TSA has struggled to deploy innovative security solutions that can be efficiently and effectively deployed at airports, such as computed tomography. This technology is like moving from a two-dimensional X-ray to a three-dimensional MRI. Fact is, you can see a lot more with an MRI than an X-ray. And it provides a much clearer picture for screeners to detect these threats. I've seen these devices, they work. We have 2 pilot programs in the United States, and yet the request was cut in half by OMB to deploy 300 machines, is what the ask was. That was cut in half. $150 million to do this. Now, that's a lot of money. But in Washington, when we talk about billions of dollars, $150 million to protect Americans on inbound flights from some of the most dangerous spots, last point departure airports, in my judgment, it's worth every penny. And I'm not going to have that on my head. And we've made our request to the department. I've talked to the appropriators to get the sufficient funding to fully protect Americans in aviation. This has also been bogged down in bureaucratic delays. Each day we fail to effectively mitigate evolving threats to aviation security, we risk letting terrorists get ahead in their efforts to harm the traveling public. Additionally, we've seen insider threats to aviation security grow ever more concerning in the wake of the 2015 Metrojet bombing at a Sharm el-Sheikh airport in Egypt. Despite DHS's efforts to enhance security measures for flights to the United States at last point departure airports, they continue to be vulnerable. In recognition of this glaring vulnerability, we enact legislation to enhance TSA's security procedures to address inconsistencies across the aviation sector, particularly screening employees at secure access ports. We must continue to close security capability gaps at these overseas airports, most critically Istanbul and Cairo. John Katko and I have had many trips over there, and I can tell you, these are not secure airports. High volumes of American travelers come out of these airports, and I've seen these vulnerabilities firsthand. In addition, we must continue to enhance airport security at other high-risk airports in the Middle East and out of Northern Africa. Doing so is critical to our national security, as these threats are only one flight away into the homeland. But as we all know, the threats against our homeland are not restricted by physical boundaries. We have cyber, as Suzanne Spalding knows so well. Having worked at DHS, I want to applaud you for your service to the department. You did such a great job. As Suzanne knows, our adversaries, both nation-state and non-state actors, threaten us around the clock in cyberspace. And whether it's North Korea launching a global cyber attack, crippling infrastructure, to China stealing our nation's valuable intellectual property, to Russia conducting disinformation warfare campaigns to sow discord among the people, to Iran attacking our financial institutions, to terrorists spreading evil propaganda over the internet, or criminals taking our financial and personal information, we are all exposed to harm. I was one of the millions of victims, and many of you are here in the room, of the OPM data breach by China in 2014 and 2015, which resulted in over 20 million stolen security records, including Social Security numbers and fingerprints. To mitigate this threat, we must improve our cyber resiliency and protection. The House passed and I authored to elevate DHS's National Protection and Programs Directorate to a director-level position and rename it the Directorate for the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. In other words, create a cybersecurity agency within the Department of Homeland Security to elevate the priority and the mission. I hope the Senate will pass this legislation soon. Combating malicious cyber activity also has a strong diplomatic component. For that reason, the House just voted on legislation introduced by Foreign Affairs Chairman Ed Royce, proposing the creation of the Office of Cyber Issues at the State Department. This legislation will establish a high-level ambassador for cybersecurity to lead the department's diplomatic cyber efforts. We must establish closer relationships with our allies and our partners and enforce cyber commitments with other countries. And we must enforce our norms in cyberspace because for right now, we don't have any norms. There are no rules of the game, and that is the problem. Not to mention what would happen if a NATO ally was attacked in cyberspace. Would Article 5 be invoked in that case? We must eliminate the legal barriers our private sector confronts from other countries' cybersecurity and national security laws, including the mandatory requirement to allow a foreign government to review a company's source code. This puts us at a major disadvantage, both competitively and from a security standpoint. We must also build products that are secure. With the growth of the Internet of Things, we are more vulnerable now than ever. Consider the recent assessment by Intel, one of the largest chip makers in the world, regarding its semiconductor vulnerabilities to Meltdown and Spectre, which pose serious risk to computer chips manufactured over the last 2 decades. These threats are real and impact all of us. But I believe now more than ever that securing our nation at home requires protecting American strength abroad. North Korea is a good example. Across the globe, nation-state adversaries have expanded their influence at the expense of our own. In North Korea, Kim Jong-un has marched down a path of nuclearization absent American leadership. He is now on the cusp of obtaining the ability to conduct a successful nuclear ICBM strike anywhere in the world, including against the United States. This is unacceptable. That is why the president and his administration have begun to lead a maximum pressure campaign against North Korea to compel him to retreat from his destabilizing nuclear ambitions. These efforts include working with our international partners to forge a diplomatic solution to isolate the regime by increasing economic pressure on the North Korean economy through sanctions and refusing to take the use of military force off the table unless Kim Jong-un reverses course. Further, Chinese and Russian attempts to undermine international sanctions on North Korea at the expense of global security must not go unheeded. The United States and our partners in the international community must confront them head on. We must be clear and decisive in our actions, which takes me to the next country hotspot, Iran. As North Korea marches on with their destabilizing behavior, so does Iran, the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. Let me be clear, a nation that has repeatedly threatened America and Israel with absolute annihilation must not be allowed to ever have a nuclear weapon. Unfortunately, as negotiated by the previous administration, the Iran nuclear deal, known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, injected the Iranian regime with billions of dollars in fresh funding for their expansionist and terrorist agenda. From Yemen through Iraq and Syria, all the way to Lebanon and the Mediterranean, Iran continues to solidify its influence in the region through what what Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel calls the Shia Crescent. This land bridge connects Iran to its destabilizing proxies throughout the region, such as the Lebanese-based Hezbollah and Hamas in Palestine. As our allies in the region understand, Iran's actions are a direct threat to our regional stability. Worse yet, the regime funds its expansion with domestic financial resources siphoned away from the Iranian people. And while inflation soars in Tehran, the regime brutally suppresses any dissidents to its irresponsible policies. But I believe there is light. Again, we see Iranians pleading for freedom, protesting openly in the streets. And I believe that we as Americans have a duty to support them. We must stand with them. In January, I introduced legislation backing the Iranian people as they demand reforms in their country. This legislation requires the president to determine whether senior members of the government of Iran are responsible for or complicit in human rights abuses, corruption, or censorship. It also calls out the Iran regime's practice of taking Americans and other foreign nationals hostage as a crime against humanity. Lastly, it outlines several steps the administration should take in conjunction with our allies to stop this practice, including imposing sanctions on Iranian officials responsible for unjust detentions. And I think the Iranian people want, need, and deserve better. When it comes to Russia, Putin's regime continues to hinder American efforts at peace on the Korean Peninsula by covertly supporting the Kim's regime's economy, which ultimately helps further their nuclear ambitions. Across Europe and the Americas, Putin continues to engage in hostile disinformation campaigns intended to sow discord among our people, divide Europe, and drive a wedge between our NATO allies. I was recently in Estonia and Ukraine. They are right on the border of Russia, and the cyber attacks are fierce and intense, and the campaign disinformation warfare is real, and the kinetic threat in Ukraine and in Crimea is real. Europe and our allies, they've tried to drive a wedge between. And in Syria, he is bolstering the brutal regime of Bashar al-Assad, making the likelihood of a political solution to end the bloodshed more difficult and more challenging. In response to Russia's aggressive foreign policy, Congress passed and the President signed the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act to impose an economic price on Russia's meddling in our international interests. And we must remain vigilant in countering Russia's attempts to meddle in our elections in the future. I got the Gang of Eight briefing on the Russian meddling. I've been consistently strong from the beginning that it indeed happened, and that there needed to be consequences to what they were doing. We need to call them out for what they did, and there needs to be a consequence to that. When it comes to China, as Putin's grip on power remains solidified, China, under President Xi, continues to consolidate its control over all facets of Chinese government, military, commercial, and civilian life. Last October, Xi was elevated into the People's Republic of China's constitution on par with Mao Zedong, one of the most brutal dictators we've seen in the history of the world. We've seen Xi purge his competitors within his country and compel its commercial sector to support destabilizing around the world. The bottom line, China is on the rise, and its influence is expanding globally at a rapid pace. And it is the Soviet Union, in my judgment, of our times. China is already rebuilding military bases around the world, as evidenced in Djibouti. This military expansion, where we have a base, is not peaceful. And we know what they're doing in the cyberspace. And it will grow as the One Belt, One Road expands, strangling the developing and developed world, suffocating freedom until its dying breath. To counter China's immoral rise, we must support our allies, partners, and friends, and expand our support to the international development efforts. In closing, as we assess the threat landscape for 2018 and beyond, I urge us all to seek pragmatic solutions to address the challenges before us. These solutions that improve the livelihoods of people around the world and protect those who cannot protect themselves. We must shield freedom-loving people from the radical ideology and exploitations that terrorists and repressive regimes are attempting to infect them with. We must protect those who are elected to serve by closing gaps that allow our enemies to infiltrate the homeland. We must enable the United States to thrive at home so that we can continue to support our friends abroad. I say we because these threats are blind to party affiliation. I've always said that partisanship stops at our water's edge. The terrorists don't check our party affiliation. And it takes an effort that will require a holistic bipartisan approach, one that includes collaboration with state and local stakeholders, private sector, federal law enforcement, intelligence community, in our military. One that really requires us to work together with our foreign allies, partners, and friends. Upholding this bipartisan tradition and maintaining American leadership on the world stage is very personal to me. And my father was a bombardier in World War II and participated in the D-Day air campaign on a B-17. He bombed the Nazis and helped defeat the evil of his time. I was recently in Auschwitz 6 months ago, and I saw the horrors of what the Nazis did, the pure evil of the gas chambers, and Dr. Mengele. But my father and his band of brothers did not think about politics when they were drafted to serve. He actually volunteered to serve. They simply put our country first. And the example they set is one we should follow because, as we know, freedom is never free, and we will always have to fight for it. Ronald Reagan once told us that, quote, freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We must pass it to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same, or one day we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in the United States, where men were free. These are the challenges of our times, and just like my father's generation, the greatest generation, we fought and defeated fascism that threatened civilization, and we also defeated communism. And I'm confident in the current struggle that we will also prevail. So with that, thank you, and may God bless the United States of America. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for a tour de force and for correctly highlighting the many challenges we face as a nation right now and the huge mission to be able to deliver and make sure that we have prescriptions to some of these issues we're all facing. We've got about 15 minutes or so for questions. I'll pick up first two, and I'm not going to. It's dominating the news, so I think we've got to zero in on your colleague on the House Permanent Select Committee of Intelligence recently released a memo, and I'd be curious what some of your thoughts are since it's gripping much of D.C. right now.
Well, first, in terms of background, I was a federal prosecutor. I worked on FISA applications with the FBI. It's probably the most serious power within the federal government to have national security wiretaps, FISA, to monitor American citizens in the United States or Americans deemed to be an agent of a foreign power. So I look at it from that context that these applications need to be based on evidence. My concern after reading the document, and granted it was coming from the Republican side, was that one of the principal pieces of evidence was a dossier memo that then FBI Director Comey came out later to say was salacious and unverifiable. In addition to that document was a Yahoo article, a press report, which in my judgment, I have a deep respect for the press, but it's not evidence. I mean, this has to be based on evidence before you put a wiretap on someone in the United States to demonstrate probable cause they are an agent of a foreign power. So given what the FBI director said about the dossier, I find that difficult to believe that that is sufficient evidence to uphold the application. In my experience, there would be a duty to notify the FISA court when it was deemed by the FBI director that it was salacious and unverifiable. To my knowledge, I'm not sure that happened. I think it should have happened. I think the court may have viewed this application in a different light. But having said, there are two things I think that need to happen going forward. And granted, I think from the American Observer, you're seeing a Republican memo and you're going to see a Democrat memo come out. I think to really get to the bottom of this for the American people, two things need to happen. I believe that the entire FISA application, including the affidavit attached, taking out methods and sources, should be released to the American people so we have a full context of what was the basis for the application from an evidence standpoint. I believe Americans, whether Democrat or Republican, need have a right to see that. Secondly, and lastly, and I know we want to move on, is that I do believe the Inspector General is looking into a couple of these FBI agents' political motivation with respect to some of these politically charged investigation. When I was at the Justice Department in Public Integrity section, we prided ourselves on not being partisan. Nobody knew what your political affiliation was, and that was for a reason, because we were not supposed to bring our politics into that office because it undermines the integrity of the institution and the credibility. And that should not have happened in this case. The IG is looking at this particular investigation, but I would respectfully request and recommend that the IG also expand his investigation into this FISA warrant application to determine whether it was valid or not. And if it's not, then it should not go forward.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I'm sure that'll come up in the next panel as well, especially given Congressman Hurd's role on the Intelligence Committee as well. But let's transition to aviation security, and you talked about, and I think very powerfully, how it will not be on your shoulders if we don't fulfill some of the commitments we need to be able to put in place to ameliorate some of the risk. And terrorists, by definition, they're thinking predators. They base their actions in part on our actions, and it's a bit of it's a changing and an evolving threat. What would some of those top tier priorities be for you to be able to, again, this is not about risk elimination, it's about risk mitigation and how we manage all of that. But what would some of those top tier issues be on your list?
Well, I mean, I think with the defeat of ISIS in Iraq and Syria, they're going elsewhere, but they had bomb makers.
Yep.
And can't go in the classified space where they are, but we know they're out there. We know they're intent on making these bombs. The threat was actually worse than I thought. When I got this briefing on multiple occasions, as did the committee, I found this actually to be one of the most disturbing and quite frankly, kind of what keeps you up at night question. Because if they're relegated to 1 to 2 man operations and using vehicles and knives, they're really, that's not 9/11 style. The crown jewel is aviation, and they're still seeking to blow up airplanes even though they may not be able to hijack it. That threat is very real, enough where we have to take action. So when we found out on the committee that we're still using X-ray technology, as opposed to computed tomography, which is like, as I said, an MRI, which would help the screeners because literally explosives light up into a different color. You can see everything in the bag that's going on the airplane. Why wouldn't we want to develop this? The answer we got was, well, maybe we'll do some study groups, and in 2019, maybe we'll start deploying this stuff, even though we have 2 pilot programs at work. My answer is that's unacceptable for the American people and the safety and security of the American people. We need to deploy these machines as rapidly as possible. They exist currently. It's not some futuristic thing. And if we're going to squabble between 75 million and 150 million, working closely with the TSA administrator, I said I want to support your request. And I know OMB cut your request in half, but he's putting the American people at risk. And I know everyone on the committee on both sides of the aisle see this as like not on our watch type thing. Mm-hmm. This is not going to happen on our watch, and we're going to fully deploy it. Sent a letter to the secretary, met with the TSA administrator, and we were working. And then they said, well, we'll put the machines in. Well, we can't do the machines without the updated software. My point of view was let's put the machines in, and we can update the software as it gets updated. So I see this as one of the biggest threats and something that we need immediate action on. And the Congress is doing that. And I know the TSA administrator wants that. We just have to back them.
You're here. One more quick question, and then I'll allow one from the audience. But you had mentioned the reauthorization of DHS in your remarks. Can you just sort of shed some light on why that's so important? If I'm not mistaken, it's the first time DHS, there's been a reauthorization bill. So firstly, its significance, and secondly, not to point fingers at the other chamber from a bicameral perspective, but do you see the Senate acting, following through?
Yeah, I do. In my judgment, it's taken too long. The jurisdiction of this committee needs to be fixed first. I had to sign an MOU with the Speaker's leadership with 7 other chairmen to get the first ever reauthorization of the Department of Homeland Security since its inception. Mm-hmm. That's astounding. And an abdication of Article 1 constitutional responsibilities. And why is it important? Because a lot of these offices, like Suzanne's, don't exist. I mean, ICE does not exist.
Name change is great, by the way, NPPD. Yeah, the name change in itself is so important.
And so ICE doesn't exist in law. And what it's kind of demoralizing to a department when Congress has not officially authorized or recognized it in law. And so that's why I think it's so important to codify these offices, codify the Blue Campaign, which I've done, codify the Cybersecurity Agency, reauthorize the entire department, because then they are protected from what happens so often in the federal government, and that's departments attacking other departments. Then you have the congressional stamp of approval saying Congress has authorized you, Congress respects you by law.
Awesome. And I'm going to allow one question because we're running out of time. But would you like to see the same? You're a senior member on the House Foreign Relations Committee as well. Would you like to see the same at State Department?
Yeah, I think that committee has a lot of unrealized potential, and I think I would go down the same. You know, the NDAA, we do that right, and it means a lot to the Department of Defense. And that's really the model I was trying to seek with
Awesome.
Department of Homeland Security. And why not the State Department, which is one of our most critical departments of the United States government? So these are all national security departments that deserve to be reauthorized into law by Congress.
Here, here. We have time for one question. We'll go right up front here. And please identify yourself and wait for the mic.
Hi, Ronald Marks. I'm on the board here. First of all, congratulations on the miracle of getting a bill through. So that was nothing less than stunning. I spent some time on the Hill and working in the Majority Leader's office, so you really do have my admiration for that. Thanks. You've talked about cyber. You've talked about terrorism. The question I want to ask is, where is FEMA in all of this? There's been a lot of discussion over the years as to whether or not that really does belong in DHS. And as you go out the door here, what are your thoughts on that structure and whether or not that continues to, it doesn't do a very important job, of course it does, but whether or not it belongs within that structure and where it fits?
That's a good question. We did reauthorize it in the authorization bill. I think when the Homeland Security Act was passed after 9/11, they're looking at all threats to the homeland, both man-made and natural disaster. And so I think FEMA falls into that natural disaster piece. I don't envy FEMA. I think there's a misconception that they have this like first response capability. They're really there to be supportive. Mm-hmm. And, you know, my state got hit hard by Harvey. We have a supplemental that we passed to double the White House request sitting in the Senate. And we hope to get action, because whether it's my state or Florida or Puerto Rico, all three need, and Virgin Islands need that attention. I will say Brock Long, I think, is very action-oriented. I think he likes to get around the red tape to get assets on the ground effectively before rather than after. And I think that's why you didn't see like a Katrina-like response.
He comes from the first responder community, and his deputy was my deputy here at the center for a long time. So, Mr. Chairman, I hate to do this. The tyranny of time requires I be a bit of a tyrant and make sure we have some time for your colleagues here. But thank you for your leadership. Thank you for being a good friend, and keep fighting, because ultimately that's what it's going to take. Some of these budget issues are crucial. And we all know when something bad happens, but it's getting out in front of this, constantly reminding people of the legitimate risk. So thank you for that. And thank you for all your leadership. Thank you. If I could ask our next members to come on up. That was awesome. Thank you. All right, we're in for a real rare treat. And as I had mentioned, we have three members with incredible national security expertise, experience, and leadership. Congressman Katko, who represents the fine state that I'm from of New York, has served as a prosecutor. He's worked a number of very sophisticated and important counter-narcotics cases. And also chairs the subcommittee on that oversees TSA for the House Homeland Security Committee. And if I'm not mistaken, you're also on T&I, Transportation and Infrastructure. Yes, right. So Congressman Katko, followed by Congressman Will Hurd, who we've recently had the privilege of hosting here, along with the National Security Agency and I believe the Central Intelligence Agency at the time. But he is also a former Central Intelligence Agency officer, has walked and sludged the talk on a lot of these issues, having served in a clandestine environment for a number of years, and also serves on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. Thank you for joining us yet again, Congressman Hurd. And last but certainly not least, Congressman Gallagher, who, a former Marine, captain who has also served at the National Counterterrorism Center. You must be the only member of Congress who I can think of who's served at NCTC, worked with General Petraeus in Iraq, 2 tours of duty. So bottom line is you've got overseers who actually can speak for the men and women they are ultimately overseeing, trying to get those with the muddy boots getting the jobs done. So I want to thank you for that. Again, I just, given where we are, I think, Congressman Hurd, we'll start with you just because you sit not only on the House Homeland Committee, but also on HPSC and shed some light, more so than heat, around some of these issues here. And your colleague, Mr. Nunez, his memo, what should we be thinking?
Sure. I'm going to do something that my comms director, Rachel, told me not to do. She's a graduate.
We love it.
Yeah, she's a graduate of your fine institution. And for those of the members of the press that are here, this is off the record, if you would. And I'm going to tell you all something you probably don't know. Politicians...
Just so you know, this is on the... It's being covered live.
Well, I'll say it anyways.
Just want to make sure you know that.
Politicians are prone to hyperbole and exaggeration. What? You probably didn't know that. Okay. Breaking news. Breaking news. So let me tell you what the memo is not.
Please.
The memo is not a rebuke of Bob Mueller's investigation. Bob Mueller should be allowed to turn over every rock, pursue every lead to completion. And we have to have trust in that process, and not a rebuke of that. This is not a rebuke of the rank and file of the FBI. Having the honor of serving side by side with them for almost a decade in my career as an undercover officer in the CIA, the men and women of the FBI have kept our nation safe. On September 12th, 2001, I was like the 4th or 5th employee of the CTCSO, Counterterrorism Center Special Operations Division. We were the entity that ended up prosecuting the war, providing headquarters support to the war in Afghanistan. And if, at that time, if you would have told me 17 years would have gone by without another attack on the magnitude of the attack in New York and on the Pentagon, at that point I would have said you were crazy. And the only reason that we've gone 17 years is that the men and women in the intelligence services, our men and women in the armed forces, the men and women in our diplomatic corps, and the men and women in federal law enforcement, specifically the FBI, has kept us safe. Okay. So we can clap for that. The memo is about a process and what kinds of information should be used in order to allow the federal government to spy on Americans. And in my opinion, unverified information, circular reporting, and rumors should not be used in an application to spy on American citizens. We should be protecting our civil liberties. It is Congress's responsibility to shine a light on these issues and to conduct our oversight. Now, some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will say, well, we should have, if we had these problems, we should have brought members of the FBI and the DOJ in front of the committee and asked them the questions. We did. I participated in dozens of hours of interviews with our senior leaders of these organizations. As a professional intelligence officer, my job was to decide the difference between intelligence and information. Intelligence is stuff that has gone through a vetting process, that's been confirmed, things like that. That was not the kind of information that was used in this application. Now, some would say, Congress revealed classified information. And Frank, I'm sorry going on long here, but
this is
an important issue. You revealed classified information. Anybody who's read the memo knows there was nothing in that memo that hadn't already been out in the public sector. Where was the outrage when that information was already released and leaked to the press? Where was the outrage when that stuff was dribbling out? The only thing that was new was that the specific mention of a newspaper article that was used in the application. So again, this is about making sure that we protect our civil liberties and make sure that we can trust the leaders of our organizations. And it's Congress's responsibility to provide oversight, even in an incredibly difficult partisan time. And I'll end with this, Frank, I promise. The press criticizing Congress for doing oversight, Republicans and Democrats being unable to agree on something just because the other side said it. The perceived distrust between executive branch, legislative branch, and the intelligence community is feeding into the narrative and allowing the Russians to win. The Russians were involved in our elections for one simple reason: to erode trust in our democratic institutions.
I'm really happy.
That is, we're allowing that to happen by having these partisan fights on this and not being able to have this conversation dispassionately. Where we should be is, what is our strategy to counter disinformation? We're not having these conversations. Oh, and by the way, we should be having it here because ultimately I think it's going to be Department of Homeland Security's responsibility for coordinating the public sector response to disinformation.
Sorry for no, that was awesome, yeah. And I'm glad you brought that point up, and if it makes you feel any better, we are actually kicking off a cyber active measures, not just exclusively on Russia, but they're the most active, sure. Other countries, and I promise you almost every country is going to be engaged in this activity. Why? Because it worked, and it's unfortunate. But I'd like to ask you one very quick question, and then I want to get your colleagues' view on that, and then we can actually move to what we're here to discuss. But should the minority report be released, and would you support Congressman?
We're going to vote on that tonight.
Awesome.
Yeah,
okay.
And the reason some of us didn't at the beginning was there were references to things from ongoing operations and activities.
Very good.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, anything you want to add to this?
Yeah, I'm not going to restate what Will said, but I support what he said and I agree with it completely. But I do want to give you kind of a practical example of why this is important from a prosecutor standpoint. I was a federal organized crime prosecutor for 20 years, and in that capacity, I did well over 100 wiretap applications. When you do wiretap applications, it's incumbent upon you not only to show the probable cause you have to be able to tap a phone or tap a computer or what have you, but it's also incumbent upon you to make sure that the information you have is fully and fairly and accurately portrayed. If you just put all the good information in a wiretap affidavit, but you don't discuss the things in there that may tend to be derogatory information about the sources you're using, then you're not providing an accurate picture to the judge. If you don't provide an accurate picture to the judge, then you're not following the standards of the Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So in this case, the fact that certain things weren't disclosed in a FISA or a wiretap affidavit to the judge is troubling to me, because it doesn't present the judge with a full picture of what this person's about. You have an informant, basically, a source. And you don't tell them that, you tell them the things that are helpful to your case, but you don't tell them, well, he's being paid by the party who he's trying to go after and he has a personal vendetta against. That would be a very germane thing for a wiretap affidavit. That's not in there. A judge may want to take that evidence, he could suppress it. If you suppress that evidence, all the fruit from that evidence is going to be suppressed as well. So that's a problem. That was a big glaring thing I saw when I read the memo the first time. But what Will's saying about the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice, I worked at DOJ for 20 years as a prosecutor. I traveled all over the world with them. And I routinely had task forces everywhere I went. Political corruption cases, organized crime cases, police corruption cases, you name it. And the FBI was always by my side, along with DEA and many others. And I can tell you they're highly professional. And so when you have things like this, from an oversight capacity, it's incumbent upon us to get it out in the open, discuss it, and fix it, and use it as an example so it doesn't happen again. Awesome. And so that's what I feel.
Thank you. Congressman Gallagher, anything you want to add to this? Or?
I thought we were here to talk about Pat's Eagles, so I'm confused. No, I agree with what both my colleagues said. I can't really add anything unique to it, other than perhaps as someone who's newer to politics. It just strikes me that we have people are opting into parallel realities right now, and we don't even have any sort of common ground that we can, to use Will's phrase, sort of analyze this stuff dispassionately. And I just see this sort of tearing apart, you know, communities in places like Northeast Wisconsin, and just people are reverting to their tribes, and we just can't even have a conversation. And that's bad. I mean, it's bad for all these agencies that we're supposed to be overseeing. It's bad for our own communities. I don't know if it's worse than in the past, but that's just, it's been so frustrating as a new member of Congress to our inability to even have a conversation about some of this without it immediately devolving into hyper-tribal partisan warfare is really troubling. And that's a problem we should all think deeply about solving, because the system, in order for this whole system to work, there's a bunch of unwritten rules and norms and standards of decency that every time one side sort of violates one, the other side escalates, and it's like mutually assured destruction. So I don't know if any of that makes sense. It's just
I think you speak for so many who share that exact feeling. I can tell you I certainly second that. So thank you for underscoring that. All right, let's go to some of the substance now. Congressman McCaul waxed eloquent on the counterterrorism issues we all face. Everyone on this stage has scar tissue around some of these issues. And I'd be curious, Secretary Mattis and the release of the National Security Strategy, and I'll actually read because I don't want to get the quote wrong, but America's military reclaims an era of strategic purpose. Great power competition, not terrorism, is the primary focus of U.S. national security. Now, clearly, context there, it wasn't an either-or proposition, but where do we stand on the global war on terrorism or a campaign against ISIS? We can't, I mean, the biggest mistake I think we do is not focus on these issues because they tend to rear their head in ugly sorts of ways. But I'd be curious what your take is, and Congressman Gallagher, since you were the last to weigh in there, why don't you start with that and then we'll go down. I mean, you've served in Iraq. You served with General Petraeus. You've seen the surge.
My first boss, Bert Steele, is here in the audience. I don't know if you planted him here to make sure that I don't claim credit for the surge or anything. He can tell you the opposite is true. A major at the time, now Lieutenant Colonel Steele. So, sir, it's good to see you. Thanks for not firing me. I appreciate it. So I was just back in Iraq over Christmas and Afghanistan. I was struck by the optimism that primarily our military service members had about the mission. I think that's sort of always a tendency with us military folks. We sort of like to believe we can accomplish the mission no matter what the obstacles. But there are very real gains that our Iraqi partners have made on the ground against ISIS with our support. Obviously, Prime Minister Abadi declared victory over ISIS. But as we saw with the surge and its success, all that does is give the country's civilian leaders an opportunity to forge some sort of durable political modus vivendi. And ironically, I think the fight against ISIS has papered over some of the fault lines that really will determine the future of the country. Most obviously, you know, what is governance in Sunni areas of the country, particularly Al-Anbar province, relative to the central government of Iraq. But I'd say we heard more concerns about ongoing tensions between the Kurds and the central government of Iraq, and the perception is that Abadi has taken a harder line against the Kurds. There's an electoral advantage, and he fears getting outmaneuvered on that. And there's a lot of trepidation around whether the Iraqi security forces will make a move on a port in the northwest, a border crossing in the northwest called Fish Kabur. And so, all that stuff's still up for grabs. And if we don't figure that out, we could find ourselves, fighting whatever the next variant of ISIS is. I think the same thing holds true in Afghanistan, where there's a sense that the new strategy is the right one, particularly taking a harder line on Pakistan. My understanding is that Ghani and Abdullah, two men who are often rivals, when they heard that we wouldn't be pulling out, embraced each other and started to cry, which is a testament to how these problems, while difficult for us, are existential for our partners on the ground. But again, over the long term, do we have any sense of how the Afghans are going to be able to sustain these gains without our significant involvement? I don't know. I think those are open questions.
Congressman, and very well. Al-Qaeda's been biding time too, right? And its various affiliates, whether in the Maghreb, the Sahel, and elsewhere. And I'd be curious, in addition to, and Congressman Gallagher just underscored what comes in its place. And I don't mean to be too blunt spoken here, but during the President Clinton's election, he said it's the economy stupid. In this case, isn't it also the ideology? In other words, until we address the roots that propagate the fuel and the ideological underpinnings, aren't we always going to be reacting like firefighters instead of directly preventing and preempting?
So a question that I ask anybody who's ever been involved in the global war of terrorism, has any level of seniority, I ask them, what day do we celebrate? What day are we going to celebrate?
Don't put a victory sign behind
in the global war on terrorism, right? And I've gotten a lot of crummy responses, but the best response was from a friend and business partner, Ambassador Hank Crumpton, and he said, terrorism is like influenza. It's always going to be around, but you can inculcate communities from it, and sometimes it grows up. Sometimes it's an influenza that's going to kill people. Sometimes it's just going to wreak some havoc. So if we think of terrorism and a model for terrorism is how you fight influenza, it's going to be something that's going to be around. It's been around for a long time, and it's going to continue to be around. So how do we deal with it? And I think when it comes to the national security strategy, a missing piece is that we're still focusing on terrorism, but our allies are getting more involved in handling this issue because you have to work at some of the root causes that has made terrorism show its ugly head. And I always remind folks, in December of 2001, when Kandahar fell, we had killed 75% of al-Qaeda leadership. We had pushed all of al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan. And we did that with 400 Americans on the ground, 300 special forces, 100 CIA, and the greatest air force the world had ever seen. Right? And we were able to take the entire country back. So it is not like the TTPs that the terrorists are using are better than us. They don't have more resources. We can't stop them, and we've seen that with ISIS's diminished capabilities. But al-Qaeda is still around. They've metastasized to other parts of the world, and we have to address that ideology. And Department of Homeland Security, with what we call CVE, or Countering Violent Extremism, is working on addressing that root cause. Not only and they're focused on our communities here in the United States, but they're working with the State Department and our allies around the world to address that underpinning and root cause. And I will make one final comment. I was in Riyadh probably a year ago, and Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, said, the problem of Islamic extremism is a civil war within Islam. I was blown away that he actually said it, because up to that point, I had never heard a president, potentate, or king from that part of the world, talk that way and realize that this is an issue that we all have to work together. And so I think addressing extremism and violent extremism and Islamic terrorism is something that we have more partners that realize it's their issue.
Thank you. And it sounds like you're somewhat optimistic where Riyadh and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is going on some of its campaign. So, because I think the issues have direct relevance to countering deceptive activity by nations too, whether it's Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, you name the bad perpetrator.
We should be looking at CVE as the model for countering disinformation. Because
CVIE, I would ask.
Okay. That's actually a good point.
Congressman Katko, I mean, what about your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts are more, they're absolutely right from the military and the big picture standpoint, but I'm going to kind of talk a second about the threats that are still exist, because they're very real. And since 2013, for example, in Western Europe, there's been 179 ISIS-linked incidents, 179. And what we've had with the caliphate being dispersed, if you will, is a lot of these hardcore survivors of the caliphate have dispersed and gone back to the Western Europe, for example. And they're ticking time bombs. And they go back from this area where they were protected and they were inculcated with this idealism to going back to perhaps segregated neighborhoods in Brussels, which have bred all kinds of terrorist activities. And when I recently led a congressional delegation, and one of the stops was in Jordan. And we were up on the Syrian border at a refugee camp. And the number of reports they had of ex-ISIS fighters trying to get back into the Jordan and get back into the homelands is terrifying. And you couple that with the ability of ISIS to export their fear and export their terrorism without ever having to lift a finger other than to press a few buttons on a computer and get people going in their homelands, and homegrown violent extremism, right? Now, what I saw in Western Europe, we went to Berlin, we went to, we've gone to Paris, we've been to Brussels, we've been all over. And one thing I know for sure is that countering violent extremism is much more active and much more effective in Western Europe, perhaps out of necessity than anything. They get into the neighborhoods, they get into the communities, and they stop something before it happens by trying to anticipate someone breaking bad, for example. We don't have that similar amount of effectiveness in the United States. If you remember San Bernardino, for example, people walking by the guy's garage, and they saw him making what they thought were bombs. They knew he was upset, but they didn't know who to call. They didn't know if they should call. They didn't know if it was going to be racially insensitive to call, even though they thought he was making bombs. 14 people died, 14 people were injured because no one thought they should intervene. So that's something, in addition to the threat itself, it's intervening and developing a better countering violent extremism program domestically is important. The last thing I'll say, and this impacts a lot of the work I do with TSA, my oversight of TSA, we've had, I think, 24 hearings in my committee in about 3 years. And in those hearings, it's become clear to us, and my colleagues know this as well from our secure briefings, that ISIS is fixated on taking down airlines, and Al-Qaeda is too. They could create so much more mayhem in other ways for some reason. They're absolutely fixated on it. They took down the Metrojet bombing. They had another bomb concealed in a laptop that blew out the side of a plane, and the only guy who got sucked out was a guy who detonated the bomb, so good for him. But it shows there's a threat, and there's an ongoing threat, and the concerns and the reports we're getting are troubling. And it's a fact that something about the size of this concealed within a laptop can take down a jet. Now think of how hard it is to try and find this, right? And we're doing a remarkably good job. But when I go over to when I go over to an airport in Amsterdam, and I look at the 3D imaging that we want to use here, and I see that they have 12 of those machines in that airport. And I asked him, where'd you get those from? And he goes, well, American manufacturer. Yep. An American manufacturer. Yeah. Well, how long did it take you to get these from start to finish? Well, 3 months, pretty much a few months after we ordered them, they were here. And then we have a hearing in our committee, and that same machine, they're studying their algorithms, as Chairman McCaul mentioned, until 2019. And in 2019, they hope to have 6 prototype of these machines at airports nationwide. We have 450 airports nationwide that TSA operates in. Yep. They're going to talk about 6 machines in a year from now and study them some more. So the problem with technology and the problem with keeping up with technology, and we can talk more about this if you want to, the lack of technology going from idea to front lines is so bad in Homeland Security. It's probably one of the biggest problems they have in procurement.
I actually think you're spot on there, and DOD and the Title 50 intelligence, they've learned the hard way that is not an option. And I think we do need to be looking at ways that Congress, from an oversight standpoint, can help seed and speed ultimate deployment of technology. But I want to pick up on one. So please.
Frank, let me add, and again, sorry, we're gonna get derailed because you can't put me up here with 2 of the smartest guys in Congress. And
I love it.
That's a low bar, by the way.
Although derailing is probably not the right term, given
derailing is not a good term.
Exactly.
When Katko was talking about the homegrown threat. And you can translate it into the lone wolf scenario, which is one of the hardest things for my friends in the FBI and local law enforcement to have to deal with. And so one of the issues that we need to do is since 9/11, information sharing across the federal government has improved. I call that horizontal sharing, but information sharing down to state and local has not, vertical sharing. And so the person that's going to have to deal with the lone wolf is that private security guard at the mall or a discotheque, right? Are they doing suspicious activity reports? Where is that kind of suspicious suspicious activity report going? Is someone able to correlate that information? So that is one of the problems that we have. And we don't even have agreed upon framework on that information and how we share that. And that's something I know Suzanne Spalding, as we've addressed her. She's done so much at her time at DHS in working to make sure there is a common accepted framework so that you can share information vertically as well. And that is, and we need to be getting the information that we're getting from our friends overseas back. The group that Katko chaired last Congress, when we did our work, it was shocking that our European allies were only looking at 1 out of every 3 travel documents, right? They weren't checking the names of known travelers against watch list information. Those are the kinds of basic blocking and tackling that everybody should be doing, and we're not doing it, and we can improve that even here in the U.S.
Having lived through some of the PNR and TFTP issue, you're spot on there. I want to pick up on one point. Firstly, and it's not the debate, lone wolves, there's mood music around these wolves, so there is an ideological. I'm not a big fan of that terminology because it assumes that they're literally alone. The reality is they're networks of individuals who propagate.
Being assisted online too.
Exactly, and they get heavily assisted online. But one of the things I do want to pick up on, and then I'd be crazy not to go to cyber. I always complain that everyone never gets to the cyber question. I want to make sure we get to cyber myself, since I'm normally the loudest proponent of some of those issues. But I do want to go one more question on some of the CT issues. And we've got 2 of the former chairs of the committee that passed multiple bills on the House side. And earlier we were talking about bomb makers. And if you really go, what made ISIS somewhat unique is it became a cause celeb for all people with bad actors. So whether it's Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and obviously there are significant bomb-making skills, or whether it's Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and some of their other sort, it became sort of that cause celeb. But I'd be curious, what is missing in the bills that you guys put forward in your report that needs to be addressed yesterday from a congressional standpoint? Maybe we'll start there and then just, but I mean, you chaired 2 committees, both here. Is anything not acted upon that needs to be?
Well, so first I should say, so my committee, the Task Force on Denying Terrorist Entry in the United States, really grew out of the committee that Chairman Katko convened, the Honorable. How
about John?
Yeah. Convened last year. And I think, as he rightly pointed out, it's just the order of magnitude of the threat is so much greater than it was, for example, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in the 80s, right? Where we had anywhere between 2,000 to 20,000 people. And a lot of times these were just jihadi tourists, right? They went, they got their picture taken with an AK, pretending like they're doing something. Whereas now we have upwards of 50 to 60,000 foreign fighters, 6,000 of which have European passports, anywhere between 50 and 200 have American passports. And these are hardcore dudes. I mean, they've gotten a lot of experience. And dealing with that terrorist diaspora is going to be a generational challenge. So from our committee's analysis, we sort of proposed a variety of initiatives, which I think are important, but I will get to what we left out, I think. I had a bill called the Counterterrorism Information Sharing Improvement Act, which basically tries to get at this issue of it's the U.S. military that's collecting biometric and biographic data downrange in places like Iraq and Syria. How do we ensure that that information is then adequately handed off to DHS, which is going to be the lead agency for making sure that person doesn't come off the battlefield in Iraq and Syria and go into the United States? There were some other bills that my colleagues had that dealt with things like enhancing the use of social media when it comes time to do screening and vetting. One thing we asked DHS to look at, though we didn't mandate it, is whether it makes more sense to put the Terrorist Screening Center under FBI purview and merge that function with DHS's National Targeting Center. And that's something where we could really use your sort of red team on that proposal. What I think we left out is the issue that both Will and John have mentioned, which is the fact that, you know, we looked at all the different pathways terrorists can cross our borders, but the reality is they can cross our borders hundreds of thousands of times every single day online. And that question of online radicalization is so difficult. I mean, I would be lying to you if I had a silver bullet solution for it. I fear that when we talk about this stuff, when we talk about things like CVE, it sort of just boils down to, 20 people at the State Department like doing mean tweets against jihadis. So I don't know, I just feel like we've sort of lost that capacity for political warfare, information warfare that we had during the Cold War, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. My biggest thing that popped in my head when you asked that question was Western Europe. And the vulnerabilities in Western Europe are real, and they're substantial, and they can affect the United States. And you have countries that don't do a good job of reporting intelligence at all. Some countries that don't share any intelligence. People have lost passports or stolen passports, they're not reported. And so when people are coming using those stolen passports, the vulnerabilities which Will alluded to are amazing. When I went to my first congressional delegation with Chairman McCaul, pay attention where I went, and I'm going to give you a pop quiz in a second here, okay? We went to Israel, we went to Iraq, Berlin, Brussels, Turkey, and Paris. And when we went there, there hadn't been any major terrorist attacks. And within 6 weeks after, two months after I was getting home and finishing that report, every single one of those places had major terrorist attacks. And what was sad about it to me was that every place we went, especially within the European Union, they said, we know what's coming. But our citizens don't have the stomach to take the necessary measures. We haven't had our 9/11, and so therefore, we don't have the measures in place that you have in the United States. And they still don't. And they're getting their butts kicked in Western Europe. And they have people living in segregated neighborhoods, like I alluded to, that are just boiling with anger, and they're boiling over. And Brussels is the best example of that, and so is Paris. So I think the one thing we could continue to do is put the screws in as diplomatic way as we can to Western Europe to get them to up their game. They're getting it because they've got it. They've been punched in the face more than once, and they still have a long way to go. And we still need to get them in that place, because if they're not safe, we are definitely going to be vulnerable because of our relationship with Western Europe.
Last question, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. So on Wednesday, we're hosting the Ukrainians for a Track 1.5 cyber discussion. And as we all know, the attacks on the grid in particular from a cyber perspective, from a tradecraft perspective, verified what many of us knew, that cyber attacks can have real-world kinetic physical effect. Clear to say that they're sort of a practice field. Whatever we see in Ukraine tends to find its way elsewhere. What should we be asking the Ukrainians? And let's be blunt. I mean, there are a lot of cyber actors here, but Russia is arguably the most effective, the most active, and we haven't seemed to figure out the best way to dissuade, deter, compel this bad behavior. So, Congressman Hurd, let's start with you and then open it up. Because I think that what Secretary Mattis was really getting is not that CT by any means is not a priority. It is. But when you're talking about existential threats and potential game changers, there are a handful of countries that are at the very top of that list, some that are more likely to potentially use such means. So talk to us about Russia and cyber.
Well, I'm going to be taking the Ukrainians down to San Antonio, Texas, after they're done up here, and to have these further,
I did know that, actually.
And so what I'm going to be asking them is, what is the latest and greatest in countering electronic warfare that they need? We should be looking at Eastern Ukraine as ground zero for testing and improving all of our counter-electronic warfare activities. They have been dealing with this in an acute way much longer than anyone else. They're seeing how the electronic warfare towards UAVs is being done there, and what we need to be countering that. So understanding their skills gap would be helpful to us in figuring out what is the next, how do we counter what the Russians are doing. I think that's the most important thing that we can learn from the Ukrainians. And then we as a country, we have to figure out how do we do electronic warfare and who's responsible for that? Who are the Navy SEALs when it comes to electronic warfare? And then how do we defend our infrastructure, and what are the roles and responsibilities between the public and the private sector? General Keith Alexander, a former head of the NSA, always says that if we think that the federal government can defend itself by itself and the private sector can defend itself by itself, it's the equivalent of the French thinking the Maginot Line is going to defend them against the Germans. And that's why, the first thing we need to do is reorganize the MPPD, right? Which, and I hope Chairman McCaul's bill gets done, because we've already codified Department of Homeland Security as the belly button when it comes to defending the .gov space and working with the private sector.
Just so I understand, would you actually consider electronic warfare? Should we be thinking about it like our adversaries do, integrating it into a full spectrum warfare capability, or is EW separate from cyber in your?
Well, I think EW is separate from. We need to think of it differently because cyberspace is a domain, just like
and it
air,
transcends
land,
all
sea,
existing domains
and space. And so I think. On the battlefield, it is a different skill set and activity that needs to be done than if you're trying to protect the grid here in the United States of America or defend the Pentagon.
Congressman Gallagher, Katko, anything?
Yeah, I think I agree with what Will's saying, and I just, again, I like to bring things down to practical examples. We have. First of all, I think it's one of the existential threats we face going forward. We're living in a wired society. We're hooked up, and I think it is a huge threat. And I also think, and I think anybody in intelligence background or community will admit that the amount of malware that's probably sitting in our public service utilities and our critical infrastructure throughout this country is quite substantial, and it's been placed there by other countries. That's for sure. They haven't activated it because I don't think they want to incur the wrath of the United States. So I absolutely think it's one of the most important issues that we have today. And I think that the identification of the methods and means by which they're trying to do this when those things are found, malware is found, is really important. We passed a bill, bless you, we passed a bill last term that encouraged people who are subject to attacks or find malware to work with the federal government, and work with the National Counterterrorism Center, National Computer Crime Information Center, and help us help them. And by stripping out, simply by providing, so there's no personal data being transacted, just the IPO address and the malware gets turned over or work with the federal government to help them. We could do a better job of figuring out what exactly they're doing, how they're doing it, the methods they're doing it by, and that gives us a better chance to fight back. So it's kind of a crude way of saying I think we need to understand what the bad guy is doing and try and outsmart the bad guy. Now, when you learn that stuff, I think it also helps on the electronic warfare side, because if you learn what's effective, you can put it into use for yourself. And I think that there's no question that Cyber Command and everything that's going on in the military sphere is going to be extraordinarily important going forward. No question in my mind, if we ever have a bad spell with Russia, a lot of electronic warfare will be at the forefront of that bad spell.
And would you agree, and this is somewhat of a loaded question because I've written extensively myself, but we're never going to firewall our way out of this problem. So of course we need to do more to share information, build resilience, defend and protect our systems, but ultimately we have to get to the point where we can articulate a deterrent strategy, where we can be transparent about our own offensive capabilities. Absolutely.
And that's why I think the electronic warfare is critically important, because that'll petrify people more than anything. And certainly countries like Russia.
What is the nuclear test equivalent for cyber? We should be thinking about that. Congressman Gallagher, and then I'm going to open up to the audience for 2 quick questions. Anything?
Yeah, that analogy I think gets to the heart of the problem, right? So, in 1949 when the Soviets detonated a nuclear weapon, I mean, it freaked everybody out, right? Because it's such a visible thing. Where in contrast, when, I suspect everyone on this stage received a letter from OPM saying, you know, thanks for your service, your records have been hacked. Because it's not as visible or at the nexus of physical destruction or loss of life, we haven't had that wake-up call, or to borrow another early Cold War analogy, that Sputnik moment, which is always misused, by the way. So that's a long way of saying, though, I think at the end of the day, this, just as our failures in cyberspace, particularly the NSA's most visible recent failures have been human failures, right? In particular, contractor failures. I suspect the solution, even though we're talking about very high-tech stuff, will be human, right? And the question is, how do we recruit the best human capital? How can we make sure our nerds are better than their nerds? I'm a nerd, I'm allowed to say that. And the military, from a military perspective, each branch is trying to sort of grow that capability organically, which is great. You know, the Commandant will talk about, maybe we create a separate career path for cyber, and like special operators can kind of do their own thing and they don't have to go back to the flagpole. I just suspect, though, and this is just a hypothesis, that that's never going to be, even that won't be quick enough, right? Like the type of guy or girl who will join the Marine Corps at 18 years old and wants to do a bunch of push-ups and get high and tight is probably not going to be a world-class coder. And so that's why I'm intrigued by proposals like Will has been talking a lot about, do we need a cyber National Guard? Do we need a cyber academy? We just need a more flexible model to make the best use of the human talent we have out there.
I'm glad you left with that, because technology changes, human nature is pretty consistent, good, bad, but ultimately it's going to be a combination probably of both, isn't it? I mean, everyone needs to be cyber aware. Vast majority of breaches occur due to human error, phishing and the like, but you also need that cyber elite force, and I'm not going to go only to the Navy SEALs, because I think our other services have a lot to offer to that as well. But it is sort of a combination of both.
Cyber warfare in the future is not going to be hacker on hacker. It's going to be good AI versus bad AI. And so if we do not have people that understand neural networks, if we don't have people that understand, how you create an algorithm that's learning, that is going to be the needs of the future. And right now, we're only teaching that stuff in PhD classes.
Exactly. I hate to say it, I don't think that's future. That's happening.
Yeah, no, for sure.
And not only in the military domain, but in other domains as well. Agnostic to what the intent and outcome is. We got time for two very quick questions. If you can raise your hand and identify yourself. I'm actually already over time. Question here, and if we can wait for a mic, and who would have the second question, if any, because I'm going to cut it after that.
That means we solved it all.
So, question right here.
Thank you. Patrick Byrne, I'm the head of Europol in the United States. I'm very interested in your comments about Europe, and we fully understand we're not the United States of Europe, and therefore we don't have a federal response to it. I am delighted to say that we have guest officers fed by US intelligence from TSE, which is actually making the border safer for the US down in Catania, Greece and Italy. But my question, and it's
NYPD too now, right?
NYPD as well. Yeah. But my question is, and it's a very broad question, but I would very much like one answer if you can. Where do you think Europe, from your visits, from your inspections, where does the shoe pinch? Where do you think that we need to go? We're doing what we can post the attacks. We've had the Bataclan, we've had Charlie Hebdo, we've had some fairly horrendous attacks on our people, including attacks on Americans, including attacks on the Jewish community, targeted attacks. And it's not just all ISIS, we've had other attacks which have come from other factions in the Middle East. If you have one area that you think we can focus on, not just PNR, we're looking at that very closely at the moment, but somewhere where you think we can improve, especially in terms of cooperation with the United States.
Well, I just got back from there a couple of months ago on a delegation, and like I said, I went to one a couple of years ago. And when I went to one a couple of years ago, before things really broke bad in Western Europe, there was this prevailing feeling that we know it's coming, but we can't, our citizens don't have the stomach to do the necessary things. When I came back this time, it's remarkable how much stronger you've gotten in the European Union as far as your counterterrorism efforts. And I think one place where you've advanced on us, and you can teach us, is countering violent extremism. From the airport side, which I do a lot of work on, I am at a loss as to why we don't screen people in the United States that work at airports. I'm at a loss. And I know the European Union now went from not doing the, screening to 100% screening of all employees at all airports within the European Union. That's a big difference. And you made a lot of progress in a short period of time. I guess my suggestion would be to keep going, because the stronger you are from a security standpoint, the stronger we're going to be. And then doing also what you're doing is you're allowing us to come over there and embed with you, Homeland Security, ICE, all these different agencies, FBI. But of course, it's the United States, and drives me crazy. I get over there. FBI is not always talking to ICE over in Europe. That blows my mind. So the more we can have, I grew up on task force concepts where you put 2 FBI agents, 3 DEA agents, 3 city cops, 4 state police. You put them in a room and say, let's go after this organization. Put your swords down. And they all brought different strengths to the table, but they all shared the information. And we got to continue and get better at sharing the information, the organic stuff growing up about the bad things happening before they become something much worse. And then have it so that information sharing is better between Western Europe and the United States. And the more we can do that, the safer we're all going to be. But I can tell you this much. I've seen a tremendous amount of progress in just a couple of years. And necessities of mother invention. You guys have got some pretty horrific incidents in the Charlie Hebdo and some of those to start. So it's going in the right direction, but information sharing, I think, is probably the key.
Can I also just underscore, I mean, we've done a lot of work with Europol, and I've got to say they have contributed greatly, especially in cyber, as well as some of the counterterrorism issues in terms of its cross-border, trans-border, botnet takedowns, and how the private sector integrates with law enforcement. There's a lot we can learn there and are learning there, because ultimately it's not a government set of solutions alone, it's the private sector as well. I'm going to let that last question, and would you guys want to comment at all on, I love, where does the shoe pinch, by the way? That's going to be a new, and it's not about just taking off your shoes at the airport, right? So.
I want to associate myself with the comments from the distinguished gentleman from New York.
He's a very smart man.
The only thing I would add is we're having this debate here in the United States, privacy versus security. I think it's a false choice, and we can do both. And I think that is a similar conversation that you'll have to deal with in Europe. And if if Europe, it's not a homogenous entity, and the United States can get more on the same page on that, I think it would improve information sharing.
Last question, and a quick one, please.
Sure, thanks. George McAleese from HWC. Given the rise of the IoT, increased interdependency among critical infrastructure, particularly in a digital, more interconnected world, what do you see as the federal role for improving kind of a cyber literate workforce? Because it's no longer just going to be cyber issues are the responsibility of your IT department, it's everybody. What's the federal role in promoting that?
Gallagher, you want to
I think step number 1, the federal government needs to understand what's on its networks. I mean, does the federal government have 100% awareness of all the devices that are on its networks?
Absolutely not.
Exactly.
Right.
I mean, so let's start there. Let's figure that one out and then go. So I don't know if you guys.
I think an entity like NIST is something that is accepted across as smart, thoughtful folks on a number of different issues, looking at NIST, creating standards. I'm always concerned that if Congress passes laws, as soon as that ink is dry, the thing that we just passed is obsolete. So anything Congress and the federal government should be doing, it should be based on outcomes, not individual technology or pieces. But one thing that we could be doing is driving the workforce of the future. And I appreciate Mike's comments on what we're calling the cyber reserves. It's a little bit easier to think about this. But can you get federal dollars to help boys and girls in high school get training that they need in school? And it may not be a 4-year institution. It could be 2-year. It could be a certificate. And then when you finish that, you're going to come in the federal government and work for that same amount of time. And then if you go out in the private sector is going to loan you back for 20 man days or woman days a year. And that improves cross-pollination of ideas. And it gets through this point that we are never going to be able, the federal government's never going to be able to compete by salaries with the private sector. So let's train that workforce to go in and then still be able to take advantage of it.
Congressman Katko, you have the last word.
I agree with these two, quite frankly. And I think part of what I mentioned earlier about that bill, which encourages the private sector, when they're hacked and attacked, to get back and learn from that and be more collaborative, I think is going to be very important. And I agree with everything else they said. There's no need to.
Gentlemen, thank you for your service. Thank you for your service now and for your service in previous years. Keep fighting. And thanks to all of you watching on C-SPAN and elsewhere, but also for joining us today. So thank you.
Thank you.